This is the sixth presentation of our endeavor to try to appreciate myth. And our appreciation of myth came out of a previous concern with ritual. And that concern with ritual matured out of an initial involvement with nature, so that we're observing what could be called a phase-formed transition. Nature, ritual, myth. And because of the pattern that we've involved ourselves, this phase-form transition from nature through ritual to myth has a purpose which it will achieve in a fourth section called symbols. So that there is an overall movement from nature to symbol. That is to say, there's an overall movement from out there to the center of in here. So that the movement is one of actuality, what really we have to deal with. Nature is a given. And we talked about how any other starting point induces skepticism, either intellectually or subconsciously, and so we have to begin with nature. We do not necessarily have to stay en natural all the time, but we have to begin there. And so any real education, and we're following a traditional wisdom education, any real education on this level of penetration begins with nature, but must achieve a movement which does not prematurely stop before it comes to the maturity of interior symbols. This whole process is called integration. The entire phase-form transition in 4 steps in a quaternary is called integration. It's a universal mode. It means bringing it together. The original name for symbols in Greek, symbolion, meant brought together. In fact, rather dramatically, because it actually connotates thrown together, so that there's an implosion. And the implosiveness comes from a tremendous energy which has been built previously by the phases of nature and ritual and myth, so that when you get to the interior symbols, they come together in such a way. It's like the cyclotrons that speed up atoms, and when they collide together, you get an array of particles. Only in the case of integration, instead of an array of particles, you get the disappearance of the ordinary. All of the identifying marks of the ordinary disappear. And the only thing that is left is something extraordinary. Which is to say that in the process of integration, what disappears completely is nature. Nature is going to vanish. Now, because nature is going to vanish, several deductions can be made, which are in fact are eternally valid. The first is that nature cannot be a thing, otherwise it could not be vanished. The fact that nature vanishes in an ultimate integration, the fact that nature is no longer there but only an interiority is there, can only be true. It could only have happened because there is no real thing in nature. That nature is a relational process of change, but is not a collection of things, because things cannot disappear. And so the traditional wisdom understanding was that nature is a play of elements and not elements themselves. That the elements themselves are only apparently there, but that what is really there is their play of change. And so when nature vanishes, it's its appearance that vanishes, leaving still active, still extant, its play. And because the play of nature, the play of relationality, the facts of change, that change is ongoing, it happens. The ongoingness, the happening of change remains, even though the appearance of nature vanishes, and that ongoingness of change is the trigger that brings forth a new realm transcendent to nature. And that new realm we're calling vision. The traditional name for it was magic. The psychological name for it is consciousness. That's something that was not there in the original play of nature now comes into occurrence because of a transformation. What has transformed? What has changed form? Nature has changed form. Nature has become the supernatural. We don't have to concern ourselves, is the supernatural real? It's as real as nature was. And it is called forth by a universal law. The universal law is that once a completion has happened, that completion is eternally there in the sense that it must ever after be counted in as a factor of whatever is going to happen. The earliest written record of this kind of phenomena is in the pyramid text of ancient Egypt about 5,000 years ago. When Ra rises anew, beginning a new day, the Egyptian Book of the Dead is called the Book of Coming Forth by Day. That day becomes real and is added to all the other days which have been so numerous as to amount to millions of years. So that the Egyptian conception of eternity was that Ra rising makes this day like a little cubic space of life which is added to all the other billions and billions of cubic spaces of life. And in this sense, life is infinite because Ra will always rise again. But that what you add, that particular day, is eternal. One could, given the right spiritual quality, go back and revisit the space of that day, or any day, throughout the millions of years. Time traveling. But not time traveling so much. It's not that one goes back into a time that was and no longer is, but what has been created, the new day, is a transcendental, elemental reality, which only when it joins with all the other ones does it become a part of nature again. So that whatever is created transcendentally is not the end of the story, but it must be returned back to nature somehow. So that the process is one of ongoingness. So that as there was a process from nature to symbol, where nature vanishes and a new fourth element, the supernatural, has to come in to replace it. Just think of little squares. Here's the square of nature, here's the square of ritual, here's the square of myth, here's the square of symbols. Once that quaternity is established, it is an archetypal form. And if one of its members is vanished, the form has to reinstate itself by evoking and calling forth a new fourth. It's a play on words, isn't it? Calling forth a new force. And in fact, there is a kind of a peculiar, odd, weird, paradoxical quality that the supernatural becomes the new nature. Consciousness does not just displace nature, but it becomes a new nature. But look what happens here. Ritual could happen on the basis of nature, but ritual cannot happen on the basis of consciousness without doing injustice to consciousness. And so the very process that was ritual must also transform. And what does ritual become when it is transformed? When there's no longer a basis of nature, but a basis of consciousness, ritual transforms and becomes art. The difference between art and ritual is that art participates in an entirely different mode of happening from ritual. Ritual is the second phase in the mode of integration, but art is the second phase in the mode of differentiation. Ritual's guarantee is that you do the same action over and over again. Art's guarantee is exactly the opposite, that you don't do the same thing over and over again, but you do something new. I think it was Harold Rosenberg had a beautiful book of essays on aesthetics once entitled The Tradition of the New. Art is original. It's ever questing for something new, something different, because it's in the differential mode and not in the integral mode. And we'll see next year, because the whole second year of our education takes the differential mode, whereas this first year takes the integral mode. And we'll see that the human person is a real shape, actually exists, but exists in the differential mode and not in the integral mode. No one ever became their real person through integration. I know it sounds strange. It sounds peculiar. But when you get your language ordered and you get your education phased in the right sequence, it will become apparent that this is actually the case. And to try to have a person in an integral way means that you throw yourself into some imaginative fantasy realm, which is compensatory rather than real. And we will see that myth also transforms itself. In the differential mode, the third phase that would have been myth becomes history. And we'll see further that the fourth phase, which in integration was symbols, the fourth phase in differentiation is what we would call science. But it has to do with the cosmos. And the traditional way of speaking is that after transformation, the pair of realities that operate are the spiritual person and the cosmos. And that the cosmos and the person are linked together. There's no way to unlink them. And they are the objective realities of the differential process. The cosmos is a differential spectrum which actually does exist. That starry expanse is there. The spectrum of human personality in its achievable, objective, individual person character form is also highly provable as an objective happening. But both those realities, both those objectives do not occur in the process of integration. It's a peculiarity, and it's one that we will next year pay attention to. So we'll set those concerns aside and we'll come back and we'll take a look. We'll take a look at how there are two objective qualities or things that do occur in integration. One of them is that whatever action is done really happens. An action, once done, really happens and has reverberations. We saw that when we looked at existence in terms of ritual, that what ritual's function is to make sure that we do what we intend. Because what we actually do, not what we say that we're doing or we think we're doing or we hope we're doing, but actually what in bare attention we are able to observe that we do, that has repercussions. You can call it karma if you like, whatever you'd like to call it. It has repercussions in that it is objectively extant. It is existence and has to be dealt with in a practical manner. And we saw that while nature is a matrix of change and does not really exist as things, ritual is the level at which existence comes into actual objective being. And so all human populations, men and women around the planet for all time, were always very careful about what they actually did. It had nothing to do with superficial levels of morality. It had everything to do with the archetypal qualities of existence. One must really intend to do the actions that you do because they have reverberations. The second thing that becomes real is that the mind actually occurs in symbols. The mind actually occurs. Now in ritual, because it has a kind of a gestalt quality to it, our actions dovetail, they interface, they come together. Existence on the human level becomes a culture, a tribe, a gathering of people. And so a culture becomes real in terms of its ritual comportment. But the mind becomes real in terms of its individual interiority. And we have to be quite clear eventually about the difference between the mind and the person. And to confuse the two is to invite a lot of very sophisticated, clever fantasy, which then parades itself and dazzles us and ends up being a kind of an ongoing carnival that has nothing real about it. Where we are now is that we have looked at nature as a matrix of change. And we've seen how it calls forth, because it is not objective, it calls forth unobjectivity, and objectivity which is the existence of actions actually done. And we saw that from that comes this need, this desire, this impetus, this undeniable, this quality of evoking language. Because we have done shared actions together, we need to talk about it. It's as simple as that. We now have something we have to talk about. And we have to talk about the objective things that now exist. And so the mythic horizon deals with language. It deals with language as the medium by which experience happens, is recognized, and is shared. So myth has to do with experience. It has to do with feeling. And that feeling is very intelligent. Feeling is extraordinarily intelligent. But the forms that structure feeling have their origins and roots in ritual and not in the actual workings of myths themselves. This is a very peculiar thing. If you look for the structures of myth within myth, it's easy to get deluded, whereas the structures of myth are in ritual. Now this has been characterized as a turn of the 20th century thesis in a particular school of anthropology, and been jettisoned by universities for about 2 or 3 generations as being something old-fashioned. There's nothing old-fashioned about it at all. And one of the real first-class minds who recognized this was a woman named Jane Ellen Harrison. Jane Ellen Harrison, who taught at Cambridge University in England when she was about the only woman teaching there. And she was a universal genius. And she was able to pass on to a number of her graduate students the tasks of investigating, is this so? How does it happen? And her only confrere at the time at Cambridge was Sir James George Fraser. And Sir James George Fraser wrote a book which he expanded over many years, in fact many decades, and finally became the 13-volume Golden Bough. And what that Golden Bough was in 13 volumes was an investigation on his part of Jane Ellen Harrison's thesis that myth is a development of structures that are first apparent in ritual. And the whole of the Golden Bough in 13 volumes comes from an increasing investigation of one ritual activity. That in archaic times, an old king had to be killed by the new coming up king, who was a prince, and that it was this ritual royal murder that ensured that he was the legitimate king. And it was the archetypal fount of the whole Roman Empire. It was the myth at the very center of the Roman Empire. And Fraser wanted to know why such a peculiar, ostensibly stupid myth should be the mythic fire at the very center of such an enormous practical concern as the Roman Empire. You'll never find better bricklayers than the Roman legions. There's nothing subtle about the Roman Empire. We are going to build straight roads through your land so we can keep our eye on you and send our legions to ensure that you send back your shekels. And that's all they were about. They were sociological sharks that were a feeding machine meant to conquer, and that was it. And yet, at the very center of it, Fraser found that this myth is played out and has repercussions, and so the Golden Bough, finally after 40 years of writing, became the shape of this. It's an enormous work, and we use the Golden Bough in the 1-volume abridged edition. We read a few things in it. And Fraser says that there's a peculiar quality, there's a supposition, there's a intuition that somehow there are magic powers that come into play and change nature, and that one has to deal very cleverly with these magic powers. And that magic has a sympathetic quality of like going to like, and also a polarity quality where unlikes repel each other. And as a matter of fact, you have, at the very same time as Fraser came to understand this basic energy thesis, originally when he was first writing the Golden Bough, is exactly the same time that another man at the very same university, how peculiar, James Clerk Maxwell, was writing his great treatises on electromagnetic theory. that likes come together and unlikes go apart. And this is the basic form of electromagnetic energy in this universe. So you have odd synchronicities happening just before the 20th century dawns, where the energy of man and the energy of the universe are seen in parallel ways. It's very peculiar. But the real genius is not Sir James George Fraser so much, but Jane Ellen Harrison. And her students were people like Bronislaw Malinowski, who really transformed the way in which anthropology was done, somewhat inadvertently. Before him, anthropology was done in libraries. He actually went to the Solomon Islands, to Melanesia, and lived there with the natives for many years, 4 or 5 years. World War I broke out, and being a German national, he was not allowed to go anywhere, and so he had to live with the natives. And he discovered that the natives are very savvy about their lives. They understand very well what they're doing, that they're very professional about how they live, and they're not savages at all. And he wrote an enormous book called Coral Gardens and Their Magic in 2 big volumes about how the natives ensure that their yams are going to go because they have the right talismanic spells and formulas and protecting spells to keep those formulas safe from others and intrusions, so that their food supply is guaranteed to be ritually pure and able to give them actual life and not a fantasy life, because if they ate impure food, they would drift into a fantasy realm, and there would be no way, since the body was impure, since nature had been tampered with, their ritual would be skewed off from the actual, and their myths even further, and the symbols even further, and the magic would be black magic that would come out of that, not good magic. Instead of life, death would come out of it. And Malinowski, who took his teacher, Jane Ellen Harrison, very seriously, was able to go native and yet keep his analytical mind. And he discovered that in their intelligence about things, that food has a basic reality to it, which so-called civilized societies like Victorian England tended not to see, because it was so primordial, so ordinary. And that is that shared food is a reciprocity in action. And that reciprocity, the exchange, was the way in which society actually had its glue. We know now that the exchange of gauge fields by quarks is what makes matter stick together. There are no bolts and rivets on the atoms. They are absolutely free form and could have been not there. But it's because of the exchange of gauge fields that quarks come together in threes, and they make the whole basis by which physical matter actually exists. Malinowski saw that reciprocity, especially of food, is one of the most fundamental and primordial activities. It's one of the do's that we must do in order to live, and that if we do it in a specific ritual way, that sets a structural tone by how we live. It's like in present day, 1994. You will not find more than 5 or 6 Taoists in China. They don't understand the Tao. But they have long since, over many thousands of years, understood that eating together is the way in which they remain Chinese, and it's a very Taoist exchange of yin-yang. Chinese food is Taoism in action on the broad sociological realm of 1.5 billion people. It's in just this peculiar way that we need to understand that there is a link, there's a peculiar link between the two books that we're going to take a look at, because in our qualities of looking at nature, looking at ritual, looking at myth, looking at symbols, in order to have some kind of a measurable tie line to keep track, some kind of a sine wave, some kind of an energy flow, some kind of a line of development out of which integration can be analytically appreciated, we're using pairs of books. If we use just one book, it would turn into a text, and there are all kinds of pitfalls vis-a-vis text, which in the last 20, 25 years, intelligent people have come to realize that this is a real problem. For one thing, the temptation to make a good text scriptural is a real sandpit, especially if you don't want to believe it and you find yourself acting like a true believer for something that you know is crap. The only cure for that is the old cure from the 50s, reading Jules Feiffer cartoons. So we use pairs of books to keep us out of various kinds of sand traps. And the pair of books that we're using in myth, we use 3 pairs. We use a beginning pair, a middle pair, an end pair, so that all of our concerns begin with an initial pair of books, a middle pair of books, a third ending pair of books. And that by observing this form continuously as we go through our year of education, and we'll use the same form in the second year, it keeps a consistency of method, very much like a meditation. And in fact, it's a very powerful yoga. It's a yoga of learning, which is extremely powerful. The original idea of this I took from Plutarch, who was one of the keepers of mysteries in the late 1st century of the Common Era, 1st century AD. Instead of writing biographies of people, he wrote parallel lives. He matched a Greek and a Roman together because he realized that esoterically, when you pair in parallels, you get a resoluting third. You get an intuition into the transcendental shape of what's being talked about. If you just read a biography, your focus is on that person. If you read parallel lives, your focus becomes what is universal about people. And so we're trying to be universal about these forms, so we're using pairs of books. The first pair of books that we used in myth was the old Sumerian mythic cycle of Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, in the beautiful translation by Diane Volkstein, who has lived Inanna so well, like Malinowski in the Melanesian islands. She went native in the kind of Sumerian Inanna cycle. And her great mentor, Samuel Noah Kramer, rightly endorsed her as being the best translator of this whole cycle, perhaps ever. At least for 4,300 years. Because it's been 4,300 years since there was a woman as subtle and insightful as Diane Volkstein. Because the woman 4,300 years ago who did this, her name was Enheduanna, and she was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the great king, who made the Fertile Crescent. He joined the Persian Gulf with the Mediterranean Sea and made an empire that stretched from Iran to Crete, 2300 BC. It was under his empire, which arched over the fertile areas of the Middle East, that set the tone that later became the caravan route. The caravan route that was like the tie line in the center of that Fertile Crescent, and that caravan route was run by the father of Abraham. Because Haran, where Abraham was from, was at the apex of that Fertile Crescent. So the entire Jewish tradition comes out of this. And because the Christian and Islamic traditions come out of that, one can say one is dealing with the archetype of all Western religions. But Sargon of Akkad could not put the mythic cycle together. It was his daughter who put it together. And the Inanna mythic cycle has a very peculiar virtue and quality. And that is that the polarity nature of women is shown to be an integral process leading to wholeness. That the queen of the above must find some way to make contact with her sister, who is the queen of below. And that in doing so, we saw that Inanna had to give up the 7 levels, the 7 veils, the 7 qualities of order which made her celestial queen, so that in her journey, in her descent, to meet her twin, to meet her mirror, to meet her sister at the apex of the below in the netherworld, she had to arrive totally nude and totally denuded of all the identifying qualities and marks that made her different from her sister. Otherwise, they couldn't have met. Because the energies of above and below have a disparate polarity charge. She couldn't have come to that meeting if she had carried anything with her. Well, we took Inanna and we paired it with Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus. Phaedrus is one of the great dialogues of Plato, because we wanted to be able to see, especially in the Phaedrus, 2 of the myths. One of them, the creation of language by Thoth in ancient Egypt, and how it was supposed to help memory. And Thoth was warned by the Pharaoh that it would make men forget, because having written it down, they would think that everybody now knows it. And the second was the myth of the chariot, which also appears incidentally in the Katha Upanishad, that the energies of ourselves is very much like the way a chariot is, that there are 2 horses, one a horse of order and one a horse of wildness, and they tend to not to go as a team, as a pair. The one likes to go in exact order, the other one does not like exact order at any time. And so a wise charioteer has to know how to run the team as a team and work them together to braid in disorder and order, wildness and tameness, so that our chariot can go. And it's the old question of how do you factor in a person, reason and passion in the same person? Because if you can't, you're going to skew off and prefer one to the other, and you're going to say, this is good and that's bad. And the passionate say, well, reason, that's junky intellectualism. Who needs that? And the rational say, ooh, passions, filthy. And just in that tone, too. You've heard them. You probably said it yourself at various times. The myth of the chariot in the Phaedrus, along with the myth of written language and the structures of memory, Plato's Phaedrus, by being paired with Inanna, we found that there was a tremendous development in our insight into how myth actually happens. And now we have moved to a second pair of books, the book of Daniel from the Old Testament, from the Bible, and a medieval Arthurian epic, little mini epic, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, written about the time that Chaucer was alive. And we noted last week that both books are traditionally anonymous. Nobody knows who wrote them. And I tried to show you that in my researches I found that the author of the book of Daniel was the teacher of righteousness, the founder of the Qumran community along the Dead Sea. And it was a Jewish dream analysis book for the Essenes, made to help them go into the analysis of the qualities of experience which were tending more and more to be interior and less to be exterior. Because the dream, while it still refers to the exterior world, participates more in the interior world. but that there's something even stronger than dreams, which is completely interior, and that is apocalyptic world-ending visions. And so the book of Daniel, written by a universal genius, doesn't just stop with showing you how to analyze dreams. It goes on to show you how to analyze other people's dreams, and then goes a third step to show you how to analyze waking dreams or visions, and then goes to a fourth level, how to analyze those once in an age apocalyptic visions of the end of time and the beginning of a new age. And so the book of Daniel was all about how to take dream analysis from the individual to the collective, to the visionary, to the apocalyptic revelation at an end of an age. And so the book of Daniel was written with an eye towards teaching people how to deal with the subtle languages that come by interiorizing the process of communication. Because the dream is like the interiorization of language. And we're pairing with the book of Daniel. We're pairing with it Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, an extremely sophisticated work. The author is still unknown. Some genius who lived in the middle of England in the 1300s. Incidentally, a time of very sophisticated people. Chaucer is very sophisticated. The cloud of unknowing, which we use later on, comes from the same part of the world at the same time. And the cloud of unknowing is very much an Middle English Upanishad. It was a time of great genius, tremendous genius and insight. The mystics of England of this time, extremely insightful, because they had begun to turn away from the kind of accepted traditional authority and went into actual experience, went into the actual practice to see what happens when you look at this. And the reason for that is not just because of the English preference for practicality, which when overdone becomes a kind of priggishness, but the kind of genius practicality that made English science of the 1300s, 1200s and 1300s one of the great eras in world history. Roger Bacon comes about 100 years before the author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, an extremely powerful scientist. He's the first person, for instance, to write in his manuscripts. All of his manuscripts, well, most of them were written in prison. The church always threw him in prison and left him there for decades. And so he wrote his manuscripts upside down and backwards so that nobody could very well read it, just like Leonardo da Vinci later on. Sometimes paranoia is justified. I mean, if you're in their prison already, it's not paranoia, right? And in the margins of his manuscripts, there are drawings of cosmic structures, the galaxies, and drawings of sperms and eggs, and people wonder, how did he do this? Because he made the first microscopes in the world, and he was able to see microscopic structures like sperm and eggs. And he was the first person in history to ever do so. This was many hundreds of years before the microscope was ostensibly a Dutch invention. English science of that day was extremely specific, so that when you get 100 years later to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, there is a quality of direct exactness that has been interiorized, which makes Sir Gawain and the Green Knight a very peculiarly accurate presentation of what happens when a myth, in its integration, falls inward into a profundity where universal structure comes into play. We would call it now archetypal action. And Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is the archetypal Arthurian myth. It's Arthurian mythology raised and integrated to the point to where the archetypal center of it is there, because it concerns two aspects which are interrelated in such a way that they cannot be separated without destroying the reality of one or the other. And the two aspects are death and sex. or to put it more politely, death and love. In fact, they're put together in Wagner's Parsifal. The great theme is the Lebensstod, the love-death theme. But actually it has to do with death and sex. Not just because I'm Hollywood Brer Rabbit and like to say sex, but it has to do with death and sex because death and sex are the two ways that in actual doing one leaves one's body, one goes outside of one's sealed energy form. One exits, one goes outside of the sealed energy form, which largely is described and made not in a differential way by some kind of personal code or ethos or ethic, but is made by a sociological structure due to the culture. The seal made by ritual comportment, which is shared and enforced by shared mythic understanding, but at a certain level of interiority, those local realms are transcended. And so Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is about that precarious, perilous, no man's land, where one is out on a limb so far away that the cultural norms no longer can sustain one. That the ritual actions that one could count on by rote usage are exactly the ones that will get you killed. And Gawain becomes, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Gawain becomes a point of nascent individuality who must make his own decisions, where love and death are presented to him exactly at the same moment in the same balanced way. It's like a psyche which is presented with pain and pleasure in such an equanimous ribbon that one cannot tell whether this particular action now is going to end up in your death or in your pleasure. And it's this kind of ambivalent exactness that is the fulcrum for transformation. And that's what this is all about. Let's come back and take a break and come back. Let's come back and let's enter our area of inquiry from another angle. Let's come in from another angle. It's just like using a pair of text. We get a calipered quality. Let's try another angle. Or, to put it in slightly different terms, if we take another vector, so we have two vectors, we can then have a relationality between these two vectors. And there are fancy analytical terms. Descartes used a kind of a tensor analysis origin for this, but there are many other things that can come out of it. Let's just take another look at what we're talking about. We're developing something before us. Like a field of energy, this is a field of inquiry. And what we're interested in is not reducing the field of inquiry prematurely to, that's it, some point, but we're interested rather in the direct opposite of enriching the field of inquiry. Because there is such a thing as natural process. And if we enrich a field of inquiry to the saturation point, it will precipitate its reality all by itself. So if we can keep from jumping the gun and trying to guess prematurely the point of what is being talked about, if we use patience and endurance and enrich the field of inquiry to a saturation point, we will get a glimpse of the truth of that whole field of inquiry courtesy of a gift of insight. And that's what an education is all about, as opposed to instruction. Instruction is making sure you get it step by step, and education is to ensure that the maturity of the material will be rich enough to allow you to have your own insight. And that's what's going on here. The second vector into this field of inquiry has to do with the Vestal Virgins. There's only one book in English on the Vestal Virgins, the History of the Vestal Virgins of Rome, published by the Occult Press Rider, Paternoster Row, London, 1934. It has the frontispiece here of Vesta. Actually, Vesta is the Latin mispronunciation of the Greek name for the woman, and her name in Greek was aspirated. It was Hestia. Hestia. The Vestal Virgins, just to return for a moment, the order of the Vestal Virgins, sort of like nuns of pagan antiquity, as people would say in Edwardian London. The order was founded by King Numa Pompilius, who was the second king of Rome, who was a religious genius. And the order was founded in 715 BC, and it was disbanded in 394 AD by the Christian Emperor Theodosius, who thought that these pagans are too pure and they're setting a bad example. We can't call them bad names because look at these Vestal Virgins. They are so good, so pure. So he closed the temple of Vesta in 394 AD. They were actually outlawed. And of course, within a few years, the women who had been Vestal Virgins became nuns at one of the nascent convents, and then everything was okay. And the whole process of the Vestal Virgins went on and informed the order of nuns in Christianity for another millennia or two. Well, it's nothing new because the order of the Vestal Virgins was taken from orders of Hestia that went on for thousands of years before Rome was ever founded. And those orders were taken from experiences of women in a very special way that go back into the archaic origins of history or prehistory. So one could say, in a practical way, the order of the Vestal Virgins in Rome lasted 1109 years. And never once in all that time was their ground desecrated. Never once in all that time was the temple of Vesta violated so that the seal of energy there broken. It's incredible. When you know a little bit about Roman history and about the junkyard that the city of Rome was, Los Angeles is nothing compared to the junkyard that Rome was. Nothing. We are really naive purists compared to those boys and girls. We haven't seen American Messalinas yet. Hestia was the guardian of the hearth. The guardian of the hearth. It seems so pedestrian to us that we don't relate to it. The hearth? Like hearth and home, right? Yes. That the center of the home was the hearth. And by resonance, the center of the city was the hearth of the city. It becomes a little more poignant when we realize that the hearth is where the food is made. The food is cooked, so that cooked food is centered on this function, and it's a particular feminine function that happens. Let's put it bluntly, if the food is no good, you're going to get ptomaine and die. So on a minimal practical level, the food's got to be nourishing. And if you carry that just one or two steps further, you can see that there's a sacred, holy aspect about food, especially in view of what Malinowski found out about so-called primitive peoples that the reciprocity act of exchanging food was the actual glue often that held the culture together. Chinese that don't eat together really become heretics, and they turn out to be very bitter people. The way to restore someone Chinese to health is to get them to have communal meals together. The old archetype of the Chinese village structure was always like the tic-tac-toe board, where you had 8 houses around a common well, and next to the well was always the hearth, the common hearth. So the source of nourishment was always the center out of which the 8 drew. The 8 trigrams of the I Ching draws on the Tao in just that way. It's a primordial structure that's not there courtesy of some sociological artifact. It's not there because of some shallow moral nicety. It's there because this is the way things are. This is the way that life continues to occur, and without it, life does not happen. It quickly exhausts its supply of energy. If you go without eating for a number of days, you will come very quickly to the realization that you have to eat. After about 5 or 6 days, you begin to get spotty vision, and you begin to get into a woozy, dreamlike state. And about the 7th day without food, it occurs to you very, very poignantly that you are dying. Your body tells you, in no uncertain terms, go find food. If you think you have problems with addiction of any sort, wait till you see how life is addicted to food. Has to have it. So that there is this kind of deep, rutted necessity to food, tied up with the hearth, and Hestia makes sure that that is sealed and pure. And so the Vestal virgins who tend the sacred fire in the temple of Vesta that never went out, an eternal flame, an eternal fire, is the way in which that fire of transformation is applied to life itself in terms of our food, our sustaining itself. In every Greek city, there was a building which was sacred to Hestia, called the Prytaneon. And if you were a foreign visitor or a dignitary, the first thing that you did when you came to a Greek city is you paid your respects to the temple of Hestia. The main road into Athens, before it got to the Acropolis, had a well-worn little loop that you went to the Prytaneon of Hestia, and you paid your respects there to the hearth of the city, and then you could go to the Acropolis. Before Athena, you visited Hestia. It was absolutely essential that one observe this pecking order, so that while Hestia to us is much less interesting than Aphrodite or Athena or perhaps even Hera, she was, in actual fact of ancient times, the first goddess. Her esoteric presentation was Demeter, and the Eleusinian mysteries are all about the inner esoteric arcana of this function. The eternal fire sometimes is said to symbolize well-being, but this is somewhat wishy-washy. It's not accurate enough. It doesn't get you. It isn't that the eternal fire symbolizes well-being. It's that fire is the transformational element, and an ongoing fire is needed for the refined transformation that's necessary in life. You cannot make snap judgments continuously and get by with it. Life requires a drawn-out process where the refining is done over years and not over nanoseconds. Transformations may happen in picoseconds, but they're lived out in terms of years. And so this ongoing eternal fire that the Vestal virgins guard, notice that there's something about sex and death that's involved in this whole thing. That life in its actual transformation cycle requires a sealed purity, which takes into the fact that sex and death are held in a perfect balance. And if they are, if neither is violated, then the violation of neither actually happens. And there's something to do with eternity and purity. It's at the very center of the archetype, for instance, of the realization of Zarathustra, of Zoroaster. I just finished making a translation of Zarathustra into English, and in the introduction pointed out that this flame, this pure flame, has everything to do with the fact of equanimity and has very little to do with the supposed but very shallow view that it has to do with polarity. The whole point is that life and death are no longer polar, but are complements held together by a perfect, sealed equanimity. This quality was protected by a function in the Prytanian, by a function which was carried over to the temple of Vesta. The function is simply dining. But let's look at this. It isn't just simply dining. The sharing of food, yes, it's dining. A deeper word for it is a banquet. Plato used the term symposium. That what is really talked about when one is aware of what is happening at a common dining, at a banquet, at a symposium, is sex and death. That's what's in the dialogue by Plato, the symposium. Talks about how the sexes were originally one sphere. The being was a sphere, a spherical being, cosmic being. Pairs which, in a mysterious reciprocity, become a unity which cannot be separated, cannot be divided. Plato's term for the division was diaresis, usually misconstrued as operating as a dialectic, but it was actually division, diaresis. And in the dialogue of the Sophist, he talks about how this whole process of looking at the apparent in terms of a process of analysis by pairs, of putting the pairs back together, and that as you put a pair back together, their wholeness occurs, and the wholeness jumps the energy level to a deeper level. And when pairs on that level are put together, that wholeness jumps it to an ever deeper level, and that there are 7 levels of depth that one can come, and on the 8th level, one finds that there are no more pairs. That on the 8th level, pairs no longer occur, only the realities, the aletheia, occurs. That is where truth can be found. And that this process of deepening penetration by a methodological inquiry is called philosophy. The love of wisdom. It has something to do with sex. The passionate love of wisdom, of truth, of aletheia. And it's always personified in the feminine. Sophia is always feminine. Asha is always feminine. Hestia guards and seals and ensures that life will go on in such a way that one could move from that natural life into the depths of truth and discover truth. Because you cannot find truth, even if it's there, if you don't have a base that allows for a quality of traction that there is a real penetration. You have to have some base upon which to begin, which can be trusted to really be there in such a way that you have gone from here in a methodological penetration and find what is deeply within. So that the whole purpose of a dining together in a Prytanion, in the temple of Hestia, in a Vestal Virgin temple at the very center of Rome, in between the Capitoline and the Palatine Hills, right at the very center of Rome. If you were going to draw a circle of Roman imperial power, you would put the point of the compass on the temple of Vesta. And when you draw that circle, you find the geometry of Roman power is very archetypal. It isn't haphazard at all. And only one time in all of the long history of Rome, was there an attempt made to move the center of power from the Temple of Vesta to another building. And the person who did that was Augustus Caesar. Near the apex of his power, he ruled for 44 years. It's like a lifetime. He tried to move the center of Roman power out of the Temple of Vesta to a new structure which he built, which is named for him, the Ara Pacis Augusti, the Temple of Eternal Peace of Augustus. And that particular building still exists. It was found in the rubble after World War II, the bombings in the city of Rome, and clearing away the rubble. They found underneath what had been the ground level that the Ara Pacis Augusti survived all this time because it had been buried in medieval times. And that whole temple is Augustus's need to recreate a new supernatural power base of vision for the new Rome that he imagined, that he envisioned. And at the very center of the frescoed murals and sculptured friezes that leads inside, there you find at the very center, at the apex, the image of Teller Mater, Mother Earth. An attempt to take Hestia and her primordiality and her archetypal level out of the temple of Vesta and to put it into Augustus's own structure. And Augustus, being a very, very conscientious power monger, made sure that nobody would ever compete with this because he collected the two things necessary, the two qualities of language necessary to both support his activity and the only two sources that could ever have bled it dry. Two kinds of language. One oracular language and the other high epic poetry. The oracular language issue was handled because he collected together all of the Sibylline oracles, which were the only oracular utterances recognized by the Roman state religion. And all of them were collected and brought together, and all scraps of any, or pages of any, scrolls of any Sibylline oracles were deposited in the Ara Pacis Augusti, because the temples of Vesta, the temples of Hestia, the Prytanians, always were the archival places where the necessary records for ordered life were kept. The records of births, of deaths, of marriages, the records of the true histories, so that the temples of the pure women guarding the eternal flame not only secured the purity of food in the life process, but the accuracy of the records by which one could make sense out of what had happened. They were the guarantors that the documents by which a true history could be made were kept there, kept safe. And not only the archives, but it was the quality almost of a museum, that the things that were necessary to examine, to get the tone of specific events, were also collected there. Special things that would go into museums now were collected and preserved there. So that the Temple of Vesta is not just some nice little cupola, but a whole precinct, grounds, many apartments, many storage places, banqueting hall, many, many, many rooms, extensive. It's important for us to appreciate that this collecting together, this archiving, this keeping together of the food, all of these functions have to do with keeping a form pure enough and open enough to receive the presence of the goddess. Her presence vivified the place. Now notice one thing that was not kept in the Temple of Hestia was money. The state bank was not in the Prytaneum. I guess you realize, or perhaps you don't realize, the biggest example of the state bank was the Parthenon. It was always the temples of Athena where the money was kept. The Temple of Athena, the Parthenon, had two portions, divided by a wall. On one side was the 40-foot statue by Phidias of Athena, and on the other side of the wall was the state treasury of Athens. The money was kept in the Temple of the Virgin, Parthenos, Virgin. Notice that Athena is also virginal. Hestia is always virginal. Why is this? It is not because of prudishness, but because of the absolute necessity at the core of a life process which needs sex to continue, that there should be a slight, small dose of virginity preserved. Why? Because that slight dose, these few virginal women, are like an inoculation against the ravaging fevers of chaos. You take a little bit of a disease to inoculate yourself, to cure yourself from the disease. The ancient disease that the Greeks protected themselves from was called miasma, the swamp of confusion, where life is so jumbled that no one knows what's going on, no one knows what to do. Total breakdown, meltdown, that the meltdown of sociological structures, of family structures, of human structures, leaves you in the realm that's even worse off than barbarians. It leaves you in a complete chaos, which is a kind of a hell. So that these small pockets of virginality were not to set the tone so that everybody then becomes this way, but that these few do this as a sacrifice so that others may have an ordered life and participate in death and sex without fear, because their guarantee seals that equanimity, that these will not be dead ends, but are a part of the ongoing process of life eternal. Three qualities, three kinds, three archetypes of food were offered in the Prytania and offered in the Temple of Vesta. Fish, bread, and wine. Fish, bread, and wine. The original communion. Millennia before there was a Christianity. Not only wine and bread, but fish. One of the best explications of this is out of the 13-volume series published by the Bollingen series, Jewish Symbols in the Greco-Roman Period, E.R. Goodnow. Volume 5, in 2 parts, is all about fish, bread, and wine. Goodnow was an extremely intelligent, brilliant man. I believe he was at Yale for many years. Bread we can sort of understand. It's kind of like the staff of life. Wine we can understand because it's like through the fermented sugars, it's a transformational liquid. It has a spirit to it. Fish we cannot understand so well. We tend to think of fish, and when we come to Goodnow, we read in here, fish as a symbol of the hope of immortality. Page 47 of volume 5, part 1. Fish as the hope for immortality. And Goodnow does the best that he can, and he talks about this, but we have to go deeper. We have to go deeper to understand that there is an archetypal level here that's being dealt with that has to do with sex and death, with resurrection and life, in such a poignant way that it was enshrined as the very center of religious experience in archaic times. The first time that we have a glimpse of how it works and happens is in the very beginnings of written language that are still preserved, and that is the pyramid texts of ancient Egypt. Before Egyptian civilization was centered in its religious aspect in Memphis, where the great pyramids were, near modern Cairo, it was centered in Thebes, across from Luxor in the Valley of the Kings. But before it was centered there, in the very first and second dynasties, it was centered at a place called Abydos, further down the Nile. And only in the third dynasty was it moved out of Abydos north. In Abydos, the original building was called the Osirian. And at the very beginnings of recorded, literary, sacred history, the Osirian was the place. The Osirian in Abydos. And it has to do with fish. In the myth of Osiris, he is not just killed. His adversary, whose ancient name was Set, softened to Seth in later versions of it, but Set is the vicious red dog of the desert. Set is the antagonist. Osiris was cut up by Set into 14 parts, dismembered. And those 14 parts were buried in various parts of Egypt, so that Osiris's mate, his complement, Isis, who has the power of life, an Egyptian Hestia, she has the power of life. She went around and collected the 14 parts of Osiris and put him back together and brought him back to life. But only 13 of the parts could be found. The 14th part could not be found because it had not been buried, but had been thrown into the Nile River, and that was the penis of Osiris. His penis was thrown into the Nile, and it was swallowed whole by a fish. A very special, particular fish who was ever after, this fish ever after, was completely so sacred by Egyptian people that fishermen for millennia took on solemn oath not to catch this fish, and because of the inability to tell when you're fishing with hooks whether you're going to catch this fish or not, they never used hooks. They always used nets. Egyptian fishermen for 5,000 years have never used hooks because of this. The fish has a very peculiar name. Its name is Oxyrhynchus. It's a very strange-looking fish. Here in this 2-volume set put out by the scientific publishers Academic Press, there's a picture of the Oxyrhynchus. This is, by the way, called Food, the Gift of Osiris. You see, the lecture does go somewhere, doesn't it? I know, it's amazing. It seems like the Gestalt is never going to get there, and like an Agatha Christie mystery. Lo and behold, somebody did do it. The Oxyrhynchus fish is very peculiar. It cannot see. There's a very good reason why it cannot see. It lives in the murky, muddy sediment of the Nile River. It's a bottom feeder, and has lived there for so many millions of years that it has lost sight of its eyes. It cannot see with worldly eyes. It sends out an electric current, just like electric eels, from its body. Its bone structure manufactures it, its flesh reverberates it, and it navigates by fish radar. And so it can see by psychic gestalt and not by worldly eyes. And that's where the reproductive quality of Osiris went to. This fish. Well, it's very peculiar, but the largest gathering of papyrus manuscripts found in Egypt were found at the city called Oxyrhynchus. In fact, there are so many manuscript fragments at Oxyrhynchus that they form a mountain. Not a hill, a mountain. In 1896, two British paleographers, Hunt and Grenfell, were on vacation, and they went to the mountain of tattered papyrus fragments that's there at Oxyrhynchus, and the two of them went over and they picked up a fragment from the mound. And it was very peculiar because it mentioned Jesus. And they were struck by this. And they meant to go back, but things got in the way, and they didn't get to go back until 10 years later. And they went back to the mountain of papyrus fragments at Oxyrhynchus, and the first fragment they took again was from the same manuscript, and again mentioned Jesus. They didn't know what manuscript. They published the two fragments as unknown gospel about Jesus Christ. And we didn't know until 1953, when the Gospel of Thomas was published, that these were two fragments of the Gospel of Thomas from ancient times and had been there at Oxyrhynchus for good reason, because the most esoteric people in the world at that time, fleeing from the Hellenistic empire tyranny that had become the Roman Empire, had a library there at Oxyrhynchus, just like they had had at Alexandria, but to make sure, because city libraries have a way of burning down. They knew that from Julius Caesar. During Caesar's Alexandrian War, a third of the Alexandrian library burnt to the ground. And of course Caesar, because he wanted to get in good with Cleopatra, gave her the Pergamum library to make up for it. But wise people realized we better have an auxiliary library, and the auxiliary library was at Oxyrhynchus because it was a mystical place of resurrection, because they knew how to navigate without looking with worldly eyes at events, but how to send out psychic reverberations and read the pattern of archetypal shapes. So that the early symbol for Jesus was always grapevines, but the earliest symbol for Christianity was always a fish. But because of the prudery developed by monks who didn't want to deal with these kinds of issues, they scotched the fish, and they went in for something really dramatic like the cross. It's peculiar, but the fish swallowing something is also there in Judaism, the story of Jonah. The fish who swallows the man whole, and then he's returned. I think one of the few sayings of Jesus that's still attributed to him. I guess you know there have been conferences around the world leeching away the sayings. One of the few sayings that are still left for Jesus is When asked about the prophecy of things to come, he said the only sign given to this generation is the sign of Jonah. It's an esoteric saying. It means that coming back into life again requires a whole ecology of bringing death and sex into such equanimity and preserving a portion, a flame, remnant, a spark of life so that it can re-energize and bring life back together. In fact, the whole myth in the archaic Greek aspect was that fire was always preserved as a spark by a hero. Prometheus was the Titan hero who took the spark of fire and preserved it in a fennel seed sheath, and saved it, presented it to man. And by man having the gift of fire, meant that eventually man would become so powerful as to outdistance the powers of Zeus. And Zeus, of course, to punish Prometheus, condemned him for 30,000 years. Chained him to the top of a mountain, and had this eagle eating his liver. 30,000 years, about the length of time that Isaac Asimov in his Foundation series estimated that it would take a galactic civilization to reconstitute itself. But as Asimov showed, you can cut the 30,000 to 1,000 years if you have a remnant who remember all the truths and can reconstitute the thing again from a seed. And of course, that's what happened in antiquity. And the fall of the Roman Empire, it took about 1,000 years to bring the seed back to life. And the seed was brought back to life in a place called Florence in the 1450s, when suddenly, bink, the eyes opened and they realized that the myths of antiquity did not tell childish stories about fantasies, but told penetratingly true phase-form transformations that happen when you interiorize language to the saturation point, and symbols precipitate naturally out of that supersaturation, symbols which are eternally true. And that man can find out what is true by his own experience. You don't have to queue up to the experts, but you do have to participate in a process of supersaturation, of enrichment, which is called education, which was called paideia. And that's what's going on here. The exact same thing. So that the banquet in the Prytaneum, in the temple of Vesta, was always fish, bread, and wine. All the rest that was eaten was brought in potluck by people. Whatever you wanted to eat, you could bring that in. You could brown bag it. All this has to do not only with the book of Daniel, it has to do with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The friend of Jane Ellen Harrison, Sir James George Fraser, in doing the Golden Bough, discovered that it was the Prytaneum that was the direct heir to the royal palaces of Homeric times. That it wasn't at all any of the buildings on the Acropolis. It wasn't the Parthenon, it wasn't the Erechtheion, it wasn't any of those buildings, but it was the Prytaneum that was the inheritor of the royal palace. And so the law courts that judged murder were always in the precinct of Hestia, because sex and death, purity and food, dining, sealedness of life, all of these circumambulate together around a single gestalt, a single point that has to be understood. And the point is that one cannot interiorize language deep enough to find truth unless the basis of life is kept pure enough that it is natural. One of the peculiarities of subtle symbolizers is exemplified by Dante, who is one of the most subtle symbolizers of all time. Dante, whose Divine Comedy is an exercise in epic scale magnificence of symbols. You can read the Divine Comedy from beginning to end, many hundreds of pages, on 4 simultaneous levels, and it's carried all the way through. It's unbelievable. But Dante in several places says, without a natural basis to imagery, there's no way to develop transcendental symbols that are trustworthy. And so one of the virtues of keeping life natural is that when you want to have a transcendental interiority that you can trust, you have to have this basis. If you contaminate, if you pollute the naturalness of life, you forever scramble any kind of base which could be trusted to develop any of the higher powers of man. And because we have those higher powers and they're not developed, we then fantasize that we're supposed to have them, and maybe the UFO people will bring them to us again if we're really nice. If we move to Sedona and we don't pee on the red rocks too much, maybe they'll see the beauty of our... Well, you can see how confused it is. It's useless. It's useless. That the true traction lies in the peculiarity of appreciating that the very arcane and the very ordinary are not so far apart, but that they curve around and opposites change into each other. And when you exchange the arcane with the ordinary, you get that kind of cinched reciprocity that makes for wholeness. Absolute wholeness. The basis of life is that there must be a way to seal energy in forms long enough that they can be used as a base to transform into something deeper or something higher. The prime loss of that seal is through unjudicious sex or inordinate death. But by keeping a balance between the two, so that the diagonal, the diameter of this circle, so that that diameter is completed, so it touches both arcs at the same time, keeps the circle intact long enough so that one can generate a sphere out of that circle. This is part of the process that is there both in the book of Daniel and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Now, I'd hoped to get to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but like a good radio dramatist program from the 40s, we have to come back next week. I would suggest getting the Penguin Classics version. There are 2 Penguin Classics versions. One is a translation. Yes, it is written in English, but it's Middle English. If you can read Middle English, go to it. But the translation here by Brian Stone is beautiful. Here's an example. Here's how it begins. And notice, we talked last week about how the book of Daniel talked about the siege of Jerusalem. It begins with the siege of Jerusalem. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight begins with the siege of Troy. Both works begin with the besiegement of a holy city and the fragmenting into miasma of the culture of both those cities. One because the cream of the men and women had been taken away and used for the Neo-Babylonian empire of Nebuchadnezzar. They weren't harshly treated, but they were not allowed to live their own lives or to work for their own place. And all that was left in Jerusalem were the common, ordinary citizens and people who couldn't keep the civilization together, and so it languished. So much so that when they came back out of the exile, Ezra and Nehemiah had to begin from the beginning, because after just 3 generations, it had gone so far into decay that there was no longer any sense at all that they had ever been a people. In the book of Daniel, one of the visions that comes to Daniel, one of the visions that comes to him is the vision of how long the exile would last, and the length of it was 70 weeks of days. And 70 weeks of days turns out to be 490 years. Now, the actual historical exile was about 70 years. That's all. When one looks at the symbolism in the book of Daniel, you can see not talking at all about naive chronological time. The naive chronological time of the exile was 70 years. Talking about 70 weeks of years, which is 490 years. Because the author of the book of Daniel makes poignantly the case in an arcane way that the tradition never got reconstituted in the right way at all, and that this was all one extended exile that has to be come out of in a very special way, so that by extreme purity by a small group, death and sex are brought back into a kind of equanimity where life can be renewed and the order of true nature be brought into play deep enough so that integration of mind can happen again. Symbols will naturally occur in the minds of those living in this way, this special way. So a visionary figure, the book of Daniel in this translation gives it in this rendition. Daniel saying, "While I was occupied in prayer, the man like Gabriel, whom I had seen before in vision, drew near me, flying like a bird." You can imagine a Marc Chagall type bird-like angelic figure coming in. Gabriel, who always is associated with a horn, a shofar, not a trumpet, as you sometimes see, but a shofar. The menorah and the shofar were the two symbols of the ancient efficacy of original Judaism. Flying like a bird at the time of the evening sacrifice, he came and spoke with me, saying, "Daniel, I have come now forth to give you clear understanding." That is to say, your mind is now capable of having a truth symbol precipitated naturally. As soon as you began your petition, its answer was given. As soon as you began, the answer was given. Your beginning was the answer, beginning its manifestation. So I have come to tell it to you because you are greatly beloved. Mark then the answer and attend to the revelation. 70 weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city until crime is stopped, sins brought to full measure, guilt expiated, everlasting justice introduced, the prophetic vision confirmed, and the Holy of Holies anointed. None of these things are going to happen until 70 weeks. Esoterically, what is meant is not 70 weeks of days, but 70 weeks of Sabbaths. 70 weeks of weeks. And so this whole sense culminates later on in a vision of the future. The very end of the book of Daniel is about a vision of the future, where he is told, "I will tell you what is written in the book of truth, and you write it down for other men." We'll start with this apocalyptic vision of Daniel next week and factor in and bring in pairedness to it, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. In your Penguin Classics edition, why don't you try and read the first part? It goes from page, it begins page 23 to page 42, 19 pages. Read the first part. I will then give you 6 points in that first part that make up a gestalt, and then carry it over into part 2 and show you how, when that gestalt goes into motion, it is carried in a very special way. The synthesizing symbol operative in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a star, a 5-pointed star, which is drawn in such a way that you do not let the pen or the stylus leave the paper, so that it describes a single circle on a single plane, but in the form of a star rather than a circle. Because this star, when placed within a circle, is the head, the 2 arms, and the 2 legs of universal man, the archetypal wholeness of man, not emphasizing the wholeness of the context, but emphasizing the wholeness of the man. The symbol for Sir Gawain that he holds on his livery, on his shield, on his banner. I'll show it to you. I have a Gawain banner, which I had made up years ago. The gold star on the crimson background. The star of gold on the field of blood. What's peculiar about blood is that it is blue and not crimson. It only turns crimson upon first contact with oxygen. So it is only opened blood, shed blood, that makes this particular kind of crimson. Sacrificial blood. The gold star is a symbol for the deep self realized, the interior star, the guiding star that comes alive. But notice that the guiding star is not us. The guiding star is like a guardian spirit. It leads us to where we are. But where we are is a journey that we have to take following that guide. The inner star is a spirit guide. In the Arthurian cycle, the archetypal spirit guide is Merlin. And Merlin guides Arthur to a kind of a wholeness which the Round Table describes. But one of the seats at the Round Table is always unoccupied, siege perilous. No one may sit there. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight begins with all the knights and King Arthur in this magic circle of Merlin and that wholeness, but in comes a figure, the Green Knight, who's going to occupy that open space and show that it is not openness, but is a void. His whole reason of being there is to show up the falsified holiness of the Order of the Round Table by showing that they do not have true chivalry in terms of sex and death. And Gawain's whole part is to show that that is an openness and not a void, because true chivalry in face of sex and death is maintained, and he is the one who's going to maintain it. He says of himself, I am the least of the knights here, and King Arthur is my uncle, and therefore I have 2 reasons of offering myself. If the least of us can do this, then you know what the best of us could do. And also, the king should not be the one who defends his honor in this way, but some kin of his offer himself. There's a book by Heinrich Zimmer called The King and the Corpse that has Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in it, Tales of the Soul's Conquest of Evil. It's in paperback from Princeton Paperbacks. You might want to take a look at it. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is one of the archetypal stories in the world about how sex and death, when handled in a specific way, seal eternity. But it is so precarious because the handling has to be what used to be called in the 1920s ace perfect. Because if it isn't ace perfect to the extent that it was missed, to that extent you die. To that extent you have your energy seal penetrated. And we'll see that Gawain is not a perfect knight. But he's good enough that he will do. Next week.